Hello everyone, today we will be talking about the chess pieces and how they move. Right now, on the screen, I have a chessboard already set up. You might notice a couple things about it. You might see that there are numbers and letters outside the board. There are numbers going up and down, and the letters are going left and right. These are both important tools that we can use to help us correctly set up the chessboard. White's pieces always go on the 1 and 2 numbers, and black's pieces always go on the 7 and 8 numbers. This is extremely important when we're trying to set up the pieces to make sure that we have the colors on the correct sides. Now let's talk about the pieces. Let's start from the outermost edge and make our way inward. On the edge of the board, we have the rooks. Each side has 2 rooks, and they kind of look like towers. The rooks are placed along the 1 for white and the 8 for black, and they are on the edges of the board. So it is easy to remember where to place the rooks when setting up. Next to the rooks we have the knights, and like the rooks, there are 2 knights for each side. The knights are placed along the 1 for white and the 8 for black, and they are next to the rooks, so it is easy to remember where to place them when setting up. Next to the knights are the bishops, and there are also 2 for each side. The bishops are also placed along the 1 for white and the 8 for black. Next to the bishops, we have the queen and king, which are the 2 most important pieces on the board. If you lose your king in chess, you lose the whole game, so it is good to protect the king. And the queen is the most powerful piece on the whole board. The queen and the king are both placed along the 1 for white and the 8 for black. But the queens are placed along the D letter and the kings are placed along the E letter. A good way to remember where the kings are placed is that the king is always on the opposite color of himself. For example, as you can see here, the white king is placed on a dark square, and the black king is placed on the light square. After you place the king, it is easy to place the queen, since it is just next to the king, on the D letter. Finally, above all the pieces are the pawns. Each side has 8 pawns, and they are located on the 2 number for white and the 7 number for black. One easy thing you can do when setting up the board is to first place the rooks, since you know that they're on the very edges of the board. After that, place the knights next to the rooks, and after the knights, place the bishops next to the knights. Then place the king using the trick that the king is placed on the opposite color of himself. Then put the pawns in front of all the pieces, and you'll have finished setting up your side of the board. Now let's practice setting up an empty board. Remember, you should always start with the rooks because they are at the edges of the board, so it is easy to put them in their correct location. The rooks are placed on the A and the H letters. After the rooks, we can place the knights next to the rooks, and after the knights, we can place the bishops next to the knights. Now comes the king. A reminder that the king is placed on the E letter, but if you don't remember that, or don't have letters on your board, we can use the trick that the king is placed on the opposite color of himself. Right now, I have a white king, but should I place it here or here? The king should be placed on a dark square because the color of the king is white. So we place it here. And as you can see, it happens to be on the E letter, so we know that is the correct square. After the king, we can place the queen next to the king. Finally, all we have left are the pawns, which we know go in front of all our pieces. And for white, they go on the number 2. Now that we have finished setting up white's side, we should flip the board and try to set up black's side. As usual, we will start with the rooks because they go on the edges of the board, on the A and H letters, and on the 8 number. We place our rooks down, and now we can place the knights next to the rooks. After the knights, we can place the bishops next to the knights, and now once again, we have a question of where to put the king. This time, we should place the king on the light squared color because the color of the king is black. And once again, we can see that we have placed in the correct square because it is in front of the E letter. After the king, now comes the queen. And once again, the pawns go in front of all of the pieces on the 7 number for black. And we have successfully set up an empty board from scratch. Congratulations. Now, it's your turn. Can you tell me what's wrong with this board right now and how to correctly set it up? Take 2 minutes to think, and I will reveal the answer then. If you have solved the problem before then, feel free to skip ahead. This board is set up incorrectly, and there are many problems with it. However, the most important thing is that white and black are on the wrong sides of the board. White should be on the 1 and 2 numbers, and black should be on the 7 and 8 numbers. This is very important because right now, white's king is on a black square. If we follow our rule from before, this is completely correct. However, as we know, white's king belongs on the E letter, and right now it is on the D letter. The problem with this is that white is on the 8 number when it should be on the 1 number. If it was on the 1 number, we could follow the rule of the king should be placed on the color opposite to himself, and then we would have a correct position. However, because white right now is on the 8 number where black should be, the rule does not work. And if we follow the rule, we will end up with an incorrect setup position. So it's very important when you start to set up the position to make sure you're putting whites and blacks pieces on the right sides of the board. Now that we know that white and black are on the wrong sides of the board, we can flip their spots. Now, we still have a couple problems to figure out. First, both sides are missing pawns. As we know, the pawns go in front of the pieces, with white's pawns on the 2 number and black's pawns on the 7 number. We can easily fix this here. Now we have a couple problems with the other pieces on the board. While they are on the correct numbers, with whites on the 1 number and blacks on the 8 number, they are in the wrong spots. Remember, the rooks go on the edges of the board, so white and black's rooks should be moved from the C and F letter to the A and the H letters. Next, the knights and the bishops are in the wrong squares. The knights always go next to the rooks, so we can easily fix that mistake. And we know that the bishops always go next to the knights, so we can also easily fix the bishop's position. Finally, we should check that the king and the queen are in the right spots. Black's king is on a dark square, which goes against our rule. We can further confirm this, seeing that the king is on the D letter, when it should be on the E letter. So we should fix this and move the king to the correct square. Now that we have the king in the correct square, we know where the queen should be, and we can put it there. And we should fix the same mistake for white. Finally, we have finished correctly setting up the board. Congratulations! Now that we have correctly learned how to set up a chessboard, let's learn how the pieces move. Rooks are able to move horizontally and vertically, so they can move from side to side and up and down. The rook, however, like every single piece except the knight, is unable to jump over other pieces. So, for example, if there were a pawn in front of it, as you can see here, the rook cannot move to any of these following squares. It doesn't matter if it's black's pawn or white's pawn. Both pawns will obstruct the rook and he will not be able to jump over it. This goes for any other piece beside the pawn. There could have been any piece other than the pawn, for example, a bishop or a knight or a rook or a queen, and in every single one of those cases, the rook can't jump over any of them. Next, let's talk about the bishop. I know I skipped over the knight, but we will come back to it because it is a more complicated piece to move. The bishops can move diagonally, but they cannot move side to side or up and down. They can only move diagonally. In addition, they can only move on the color of their square. So a dark squared bishop, like right here, can only move on dark squares. He can never move to light squares. Like rooks, bishop cannot jump over any pieces. So if there was a pawn right here, or any other piece, the bishop would not be able to move to any of these squares. Next, let's talk about the queen. The queen is basically a rook combined with a bishop. A queen can move side to side, up and down, and also diagonally. And unlike a bishop, it can move to any colored square, because as you can see in this example, the black queen right here is on a dark square. It can move like a bishop, so it can control dark squares, but also can move like a rook, so it can move sideways to a light square and control light squares as well. The combination of up and down, side to side, and diagonal allows the queen to be the most powerful piece on the board. It can easily move to any square, but also, just like the rook and the bishop, it cannot jump over any piece. But because it can move very well, it can easily move around these pieces. Now, let's talk about the king. The king is the most important piece in the game. If it is captured, you lose the game. However, the king is also the least powerful piece in the game. It can only move one square at a time. It can move to any square around it, so if the king was here, it can move to any of these squares, but again, it can only move one square at a time, so it moves very slowly. Therefore, many people don't move their king until the very end of the game, where there aren't many pieces left. Pawns are a very special type of piece. Pawns move one square forward at a time, and they attack diagonally. Pawns can only move forward, and they can only attack diagonally forward. However, a pawn cannot attack in front of him, and it cannot move diagonally. It can only move forward, and it can only attack diagonally forward. So, in this position, white's pawn cannot move forward or attack diagonally because black's pawn is right in front of the pawn and not diagonal to it. If black's pawn were shifted to the left or to the right, white could now either move forward or take black's pawn by attacking diagonally, whichever one he chooses. Pawns are also special in that on the first move, they are able to move both one square forward or two square forward, depending on whichever one you choose. So, when a pawn is in the starting position for white's pawn on the 2 number, white can either move forward 2 squares or up 1 square. However, if the pawn has already moved, it cannot move 2 squares up again. It can only do that in the starting position, where it has not moved yet. Finally, let's talk about the knight. The knight is a special piece, as it is the only piece that can jump over other pieces. The knight also moves in a very unique pattern. It moves in a sort of L shape. It can move 2 squares forward or backwards and 1 square to the side, or it can move 1 square forward or backwards and 2 squares to the side. So, if we have a knight on this square, it can move to any of these squares. It can move 2 squares forward, 1 square to the right, 2 squares forward, 1 square to the left, 2 squares backwards, 1 square to the right, 2 squares backwards, 1 square to the left, or it can also move 1 square forward, 2 squares to the right, 1 square forward, 2 squares to the left, 1 square backwards, 2 squares to the right, and 1 square backwards, 2 squares to the left. A knight moves in a total of 3 squares, and it will either move 2 squares up or down and 1 square side to side, or it will move 1 square up or down and 2 squares to the side and side. Pawns are tricky, as there are many different ways they can move, and there are many different situations. Take 3 minutes to think of, for each one of black's pawns, how many moves it can move. So for example, how many moves can this pawn move? How many moves can this pawn move? And how many moves can this pawn move? I will reveal the solution in 3 minutes. So, for this pawn, there are no possible moves, since a pawn can move forward and attack diagonally, but white's pawn is directly in front of it, so it cannot move forward, and there are no white pawns diagonally in front of black's pawn, so it can also not attack diagonally. So it is stuck here and has no moves. This pawn has 3 moves it can make. It can either attack white's pawn diagonally and take it. It can also move forward 1 square. And also, since it is in its starting position on the number 7 and has not moved yet, it can move forward 2 squares as well. Remember, this is a special situation that only occurs if the pawn hasn't moved yet. Finally, for this pawn, it has 1 possible move. It can capture white's pawn since it is attacking it diagonally. It, however, cannot move forward because white's pawn is blocking it, as it is in front of it. Congratulations, you have solved the puzzle. So now, in this example, take some time to think how many possible rook moves there are in total, including both rooks. Take 2 minutes to think of it, and I will show the solution in 2 minutes. So there are 13 possible rook moves in this position. As you can recall, the rooks move side to side and up and down, and they cannot jump over pieces. So this rook here can move 1 square to the right. So this is 1 square where the rook can move, but it cannot move 2 squares to the right, or 3 squares, or any other amount of squares to the right, because of the knight that blocks the rook, as the rook cannot jump over any other pieces, so it can only move 1 square to the right. However, there are no pieces blocking him going up and down, so he can move freely. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are now 8 total moves where he can move, as he can go 7 up and down. This other rook here can also move 1 square to the left. However, he cannot move more because the bishop is blocking him, and he cannot jump over the bishop. He can also move 2 squares to the right, but he cannot move more because that is the edge of the board. Finally, he can move one square up and one square down, as a pawn blocks him from moving more squares up, and the edge of the board blocks him from moving more squares down. So in total, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 squares where the rooks can move in this position. In this example, think what happens if black's pawn here tries to take white's pawn. Calculate what happens in the series of captures which might occur afterwards. Take 4 minutes for this complicated example, and as usual, if you solve it early, skip ahead 4 minutes to when I reveal the answer. So, if black takes white's pawn, white can also capture back. Pawns attack and capture diagonally, so white's pawn here can take black's pawn. Now, black can also take white's pawn. Knights, as you recall, can move 2 squares up and down and 1 square sideways, so this black knight can move 2 squares up and 1 square to the left and capture this pawn. White's knight can also do the same and capture black's. White's knight can also do the same and capture black's knight. It can move 1 square forward and 2 squares to the side and capture black's knight. Bishops move and attack diagonally, so black's bishop here can capture white's knight. And white's bishop can do the same, since black's bishop is diagonal of white's bishop. Rooks move and attack vertically and horizontally, so this black rook can capture this white bishop. And the same can be done by white's rook, because black's rook is in front of white's rook. Now, queens can move like rooks and bishops, so they can move forward and backwards and diagonal. So, this black queen can finally capture white's rook, because it is diagonal of the queen. And finally, there are no more captures to be made, because there is no other piece attacking and controlling the square where black's queen is. Congratulations, you have solved the puzzle. Thank you all for listening and learning today. As a recap, when setting up the board, white's pieces always go on the 1 and 2 numbers, and black's pieces always go on the 7 and 8 numbers. You can set up a board easily by first starting with the rooks and moving inward to the knights, the bishops, and then the queen and kings. You can use the trick that the king belongs on the color opposite of himself to figure out where the king goes and put the queen next to him. Alternatively, you can just find the E letter and place the king on the E letter and the queen next to it. Afterwards, the pawns go in front of the other pieces on the 2 number for white and the 7 number for black. And then you're finished setting up the board. The only piece that can jump over other pieces is the knight. And the knight can move either 2 squares forward or backwards and 1 square to the side, or 1 square forward and backwards and 2 squares to the side. In some cases, it looks like the knight is moving in an L shape. Rooks can move horizontally and vertically, and bishops can move diagonally, and only on their own color. A queen can move like a rook and a bishop. It can move horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. A king can move 1 square to any direction, but only 1 square at a time. And finally, a pawn is a unique piece. It can only move forwards, and it can only attack diagonally forwards. So it cannot move backwards, and it cannot move diagonally backwards or forwards. And it cannot capture pieces in front of it. Also, a pawn can move 2 squares at a time if it is in its starting position and it has not moved yet. That's all. Thank you all for watching, and have a good day.